This is a direct attack.
It's not going in a good direction, going in quite a bad one.
We will take a pragmatic approach.
Something big is happening in the global food trade, and most people haven't even noticed. This isn't about headlines or breaking news alerts. It's about quiet decisions being made in boardrooms, trade ministries, and shipping terminals. Decisions that are quietly rewriting the flow of food around the world. For decades, the United States sat at the center of this network. If you produced wine in France, grain in Egypt, spices in India, or seafood in Japan, you knew where your number one customer was. America. It was a given. Reliable, profitable, unshakable. But that certainty is gone. In its place, a new reality where countries are pulling their exports from U.S. ports and sending them north straight into Canada's open arms. It's not a slow drift. It's a deliberate pivot, a rerouting of loyalty, a reshaping of the dinner table. And the reasons run deeper than just money. This is about trust. Trust that shipments won't be delayed by political games, that ports won't choke supply over sudden policy shifts, that a handshake agreement will actually mean something 6 months later. Over the last 12 months alone, 11 countries have chosen Canada over the United States in their grocery trade plans. Not just small suppliers, we're talking agricultural powerhouses, cultural icons, and nations whose exports shape what the average North American family eats every single week. From South America's fresh fruit to Asia's gourmet sauces, from Europe's premium wines to Africa's life-sustaining grains. The shift is massive, and it's happening right now. And buried in this list is one country whose decision could collapse entire categories of American imports overnight, leaving U.S. consumers staring at empty shelves where their favorite products used to be. Today, we're going to break down all 11. Some of these moves will surprise you. Others will shock you. And by the time we get to number 1, you'll see that this isn't just a trade story. It's an economic war being fought in plain sight. And the grocery aisle is the new frontline. On the west coast of Canada, something subtle is happening in the produce aisle. At first, shoppers barely noticed. A new sticker here, a different crate label there. But look closer, and you'll see the change. Grapes, blueberries, and citrus that once proudly bore California now say, product of Chile. It might seem like a small detail, but it's the tip of a much bigger shift. In early 2025, Chilean agricultural cooperatives began holding closed-door meetings with Canadian trade delegates. Their mission? To design a fast-track export corridor specifically for fresh fruit, wine, and cold-stored goods, a system that would bypass the growing tangle of U.S. customs delays. Why the sudden urgency? In Washington, new cross-border inspection rules had created bottlenecks so bad that exporters were watching their products lose value in real time. Fruit that was supposed to be on store shelves in 3 days was still sitting in inspection warehouses a week later. By the time it reached its destination, the premium quality was gone, and so was the profit. For exporters who deal in perishables, time isn't just money. It's survival. Ottawa's pitch to Chile was simple: fewer bottlenecks, transparent regulations, and a predictable schedule. That was enough to turn interest into action. Within months, Walmart Canada swooped in and signed a 3-year exclusivity deal with Chile's National Association of Fruit Exporters. That contract guaranteed Chilean grapes, blueberries, and even citrus products prime shelf space in Canadian stores, products that, until recently, had been bound almost entirely for U.S. markets. The results were immediate and striking. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, fruit shipments from Chile to Canada surged 22%, while U.S. imports fell by 15%, not because of bad harvests, but because Chile no longer wanted to risk the uncertainty of American ports. But this wasn't just a logistical decision, it was a reputational pivot. Chilean officials began publicly referring to Canada as their North American anchor market, a title that used to belong exclusively to the United States. Canadian cities like Vancouver and Calgary became strategic springboards, distributing Chilean goods across the continent without the unpredictable politics of Washington getting in the way. And here's the part most Americans don't realize. When a country rewires its export map for something as perishable as fruit, it's rarely a temporary move. It's infrastructure, it's contracts, it's trust. And those things don't switch back overnight. This was the first visible crack in America's dominance over the grocery supply chain. But it wouldn't be the last. Because while Chile was redrawing its fruit routes, a Caribbean nation was quietly doing something even bolder, and their move would send shockwaves through the entire fresh produce market. When most people think of Jamaica, they picture golden beaches, reggae rhythms, and rum distilleries. But there's another side to Jamaica's identity, one that's built on a razor-thin margin of speed, freshness, and timing. Bananas, plantains, rum, callaloo, ackee. These aren't just cultural exports. They're perishable lifelines for Jamaica's economy. For decades, the United States was the #1 destination for these goods. The roots were well-worn, the relationships long-standing. But in 2024, that relationship started to rot. Literally. That year, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration updated its import inspection protocols for tropical produce. On paper, the changes sounded harmless: new safety checks, additional compliance SIPs. In reality, it meant that shipments were getting stuck at U.S. ports for up to 12 extra days. For tropical exports, 12 days is a death sentence. Bananas browned before they could be stocked. Rum shipments sat idle, racking up storage costs. Refrigerated containers were held so long that the cold chain, the constant temperature needed to preserve freshness, broke entirely. Every delay meant more spoilage, more wasted money, more angry buyers. By early 2025, exporters in Kingston and Montego Bay had reached a breaking point. Quietly, they began rerouting cargo ships away from Miami and Houston, instead pointing them toward Toronto, Halifax, and Vancouver. Why Canada? Ottawa's pre-clearance agreements with Caribbean nations offered something the U.S. no longer could: predictable inspection times. With the right paperwork, shipments could be cleared before they even left Jamaican ports, allowing them to move seamlessly through Canadian docks on arrival. The shift happened so fast that even industry insiders were caught off guard. Within 6 months, Jamaican grocery exports to the U.S. had fallen 18%, while Canadian imports surged. Grocery giant Metro doubled its Caribbean aisle space, adding new rum brands, fresh plantains, and authentic Jamaican callaloo to shelves. Air Canada's cargo division even restructured flight routes so that planes returning from tourist-heavy Montego Bay were now loaded with Jamaican goods heading straight to Canadian distribution centers. The Jamaican government gave this strategy a name: the North Star Pivot, a deliberate realignment of trade toward Canada as the preferred hub for reaching North American consumers. When asked why, one trade official's answer was blunt: "We don't have time for politics. We have perishable goods." Canada understands that. It was a statement that stung Washington, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. The U.S. could no longer be trusted to keep trade flowing smoothly, and Jamaica wasn't alone in making that calculation. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of Europe, one of the world's most influential food exporters was quietly making the exact same choice, and their decision would put a permanent dent in America's gourmet shelves. Germany's departure from the U.S. grocery market didn't make splashy headlines. There were no angry press conferences, no threats of tariffs, no fiery speeches. But if you knew where to look, you could see the shift happening in real time on the shelves of American specialty stores. Bratwurst that once arrived in New York by the truckload, missing. Wheels of aged Gouda and Emmental that used to ship directly to high-end U.S. delis, now turning up in Canadian cold storage facilities. Bags of rye crisps and tins of German mustard, harder to find in Chicago, but suddenly abundant in Toronto and Montreal. It wasn't a supply shortage. It was a supply choice. In early 2025, the German Agricultural Export Authority made a quiet but seismic decision. Nearly 1/3 of its gourmet food exports bound for North America would no longer go to the United States. They'd go to Canada instead. The trigger was an American customs crackdown. Washington had started tightening enforcement on European dairy and processed food imports, citing compliance irregularities that German producers called exaggerated and inconsistent. For exporters, the real problem wasn't the rules, it was the unpredictability. Containers that should have cleared customs in hours were being held for days, sometimes weeks, with no clear explanation. Germany didn't need to tolerate that. Canadian officials, sensing opportunity, extended what they called a handshake over a red tape wall. No shortcuts, no lowered standards, just clear rules, transparent inspections, and faster turnaround. Ontario-based distributors like Arla Foods and John K. Overwheelit moved quickly to lock in contracts that would bypass U.S. ports entirely. It worked. In the first half of 2025 alone, Canadian imports of German specialty goods, from sausages to stolen cake, spiked 28%. Meanwhile, the absence in U.S. stores was noticeable. Restaurant suppliers in New York scrambled to find alternatives for authentic German bratwurst. Chicago's European bakeries complained about shortages of traditional rye flour blends. Even Aldi and Lidl, Germany's own global grocery chains, shifted more of their North American investment into Canadian hubs like Hamilton and Laval, treating them as the new launch pads for distribution. Inside Germany's trade ministry, the language changed. For decades, Los Angeles or Miami were described as their anchor ports for North America. Now, that title belongs to Canada. And for the United States, the loss isn't just in gourmet goods, it's in prestige. Because when one of the world's most respected exporters decides you're no longer worth the trouble, other countries take notice. And notice they did. Thousands of kilometers away, in East Asia, another export giant was about to make its own precision strike, and it would transform what North Americans see on their shelves every single week. South Korea's global food brands are household names, from instant noodle giants like Nongshim, Samyang, and Ottogi, to premium soy sauces and sesame oils. Their products aren't just popular, they're addictive staples for millions of North American households. But in 2025, those very staples started vanishing from American shelves, not because of shortages, but because they were stuck in limbo. A wave of new U.S. packaging and labeling regulations, seemingly small tweaks to font sizes, nutritional disclosures, and ingredient translations, turned routine shipments into customs nightmares. Cargo that should have cleared in a day was sitting in port warehouses for weeks. For Korean exporters used to just-in-time logistics, this was chaos. The response was as swift as it was strategic. Within 5 months, South Korea had rerouted over $150 million worth of food shipments from the United States to Canada. And they didn't just send the goods north, they rewired the infrastructure behind them. Costco Canada signed exclusivity deals with 3 of Korea's top food brands, locking in prime shelf space and guaranteeing that Canadian customers would never see the shortages Americans were facing. Korean noodle aisles doubled in size at retailers from Vancouver to Calgary. In Metro Vancouver, something historic happened. Korean soy sauce outsold American soy sauce for the first time ever. But this wasn't just about keeping products moving, it was about future-proofing. South Korean trade officials had been quietly preparing for a U.S. pivot since late 2024, sensing that American customs rules were becoming more volatile. Canada offered what the U.S. no longer could: transparent regulation, predictable inspection times, and faster port turnaround. They acted on it hard. New semi-permanent Korean distribution hubs were established in Halifax and Toronto, described by one Korean trade minister as Asia's bridge to North American kitchens. These hubs weren't just warehouses, they were strategic launch points built to feed Korean products into Canadian stores first, and only then into select U.S. markets. And while American grocery chains were still untangling their backlogs, Canadian consumers were already enjoying the spoils: fresh shipments of noodles, sauces, rice, barley, and even seasonal Korean snacks that used to land in California first. It was a textbook example of Korea's ability to adapt with surgical precision, turning a trade problem into a competitive advantage almost overnight. And yet, as impactful as this pivot was, the next country's move dwarfed it in sheer scale. Because Brazil wasn't just redirecting specialty products, it was redirecting entire industries of meat, sugar, and ethanol away from the United States. And Canada was ready to take it all. Brazil isn't just a player in the global agricultural market, it's a powerhouse. The country dominates exports of beef, poultry, sugar, and ethanol, feeding entire continents and fueling massive industries. For decades, a huge share of that production flowed into the United States. But in 2025, that pipeline was hit with a sledgehammer. The U.S. government introduced carbon border adjustment taxes, tariffs designed to penalize goods linked to deforestation or high emissions. On paper, it was framed as a climate initiative. In practice, it slapped up to 18% in extra costs onto Brazilian meat and sugar shipments. For U.S. consumers, that meant higher prices at the checkout. For Brazilian exporters, it meant something worse: an unpredictable and increasingly hostile market. So Brazil did what economic heavyweights do best. It didn't argue, it pivoted. Trade envoys from Alberta and Saskatchewan seized the opening, flying to Sao Paulo and Brasilia to pitch Canada as the perfect alternative. No sudden tariff spikes, no weaponized regulations, just stable terms and reliable ports. The result was one of the fastest agricultural trade realignments in modern history. Within just 2 quarters, Brazil was supplying nearly 20% of Canada's processed meat market. Massive contracts worth over $2 billion CAD were signed with Canadian food processors, desperate to keep shelves stocked without paying inflated U.S. prices. It didn't stop with beef and poultry. Manitoba ethanol refiners, pushed by Canada's green fuel mandates, began importing sugarcane ethanol from Brazil. In less than a year, it accounted for 10% of the province's total gasoline blend. Brazil's government even formalized the relationship by launching the Brazil-Canada Renewable Energy Fund in late 2024, co-investing in ethanol and clean energy byproducts. This wasn't just about moving product, it was about building a long-term alliance. And while American supermarkets scrambled to replace missing frozen beef and refined sugar, often turning to smaller, more expensive suppliers, Canadian consumers saw no shortage. In fact, Canadian prices in many categories stayed more stable than in the US, a quiet but powerful win for Ottawa's strategy. Inside Brazil's agriculture ministry, officials started using a phrase they had never applied to any nation outside China or the US. Canada is now our northern anchor. For Washington, this was a body blow. Losing a supplier like Brazil doesn't just leave a gap, it sends a signal to the rest of the world. If the US can lose a trade partner of this size, it can lose anyone. And that signal was received loud and clear in Paris, where France, one of America's oldest allies, was about to make a deeply symbolic and culturally loaded shift that went far beyond trade. When French wine no longer arrives in Manhattan first, something in the world order has shifted. For decades, the image was iconic. Cases of champagne rolling into New York's high-end restaurants, wedges of brie and camembert filling American cheese counters, crates of truffles and charcuterie making their way into gourmet shops from Boston to San Francisco. France wasn't just a supplier to the US. It was a cultural partner. Its food was as much about prestige as it was about profit. But in 2025, that prestige took a detour north. It started with a familiar flashpoint: tariffs. After the United States imposed 25% duties on premium European foods, part of a wider transatlantic trade spat, French exporters found themselves squeezed. The tariffs made their luxury products harder to sell in the US, not because demand had dropped, but because the margins had. Importers hesitated, distributors delayed orders, and suddenly France's most iconic goods were stuck in warehouses instead of being poured into glasses and sliced onto plates. France's response was deliberate and quiet. No fiery speeches, no public threats. Instead, invoices were simply redirected. Within 9 months, French food exports to Canada had risen 18%, topping 22 billion CAD for the first time in history. Shipments of champagne from Moet and Chandon and Veuve Clicquot that once landed in New York or Los Angeles were now routed to Vancouver and Montreal. Canadian retailers embraced the shift with open arms. Loblaw and Quebec-based grocers rolled out entire premium French aisles, not as seasonal promotions, but as permanent fixtures. The timing couldn't have been better. Under Canada's Strategic Partnership Agreement with the European Union, a tariff mitigation clause had been triggered, allowing French exporters to bypass much of the cost burden their US contracts now carried. But here's where it became more than just economics. In Paris, agricultural ministers began openly describing Canada as France's preferred point of entry into the North American food ecosystem. That title once belonged exclusively to the United States, and its loss carries symbolic weight. Food is one of France's most potent forms of soft power, and now that influence is bypassing America entirely. The shift even spilled into adjacent industries. High-end fashion houses began co-branding luxury pantry goods, truffle oils, artisan jams, designer chocolates, and sending them to Canada's wealthiest neighborhoods. In Toronto's upscale districts, it became a point of pride to host dinner parties stocked with French imports that many US friends couldn't easily get anymore. For American consumers, the changes were subtle at first. A missing wine label here, a limited cheese selection there. But behind the scenes, the damage was deeper. A trusted cultural bond had loosened, replaced by a trade relationship built on speed, trust, and shared strategy, with Canada at the center. And if France's pivot was about luxury and prestige, the next country's move was about survival. Because in Egypt, the question wasn't whether they'd lose a gourmet cheese. It was whether they could secure enough wheat to feed their people. For Egypt, wheat isn't just another import. It's the foundation of national stability. Bread is a daily necessity for more than 100 million people, and the government's bread subsidy program is one of the most sensitive political issues in the country. If wheat shipments falter, it's not just an economic problem. It's a potential trigger for unrest. For decades, the United States was one of Egypt's primary suppliers. American grain filled the cargo holds of massive bulk carriers bound for Alexandria, sustaining Egypt's food system. The relationship was so entrenched that many assumed it could never change. But in 2024, cracks began to form. A combination of climate volatility in the US Midwest and global bidding wars pushed wheat prices to dangerous highs. Heat waves and erratic rainfall hammered American yields. Shipping schedules slipped. Freight costs from Gulf ports climbed sharply. Egypt, already operating on thin margins for its subsidies, found itself paying more for less and waiting longer to get it. For Cairo, the risk was clear. Keep depending on an increasingly unstable supply, or find a new anchor. That anchor was Canada. By early 2025, Egyptian trade officials had inked new contracts with Saskatchewan growers, shifting 60% of Egypt's new wheat supply to Canadian sources in just 1 quarter. But this wasn't just a handshake deal for raw grain. Canadian agri-tech startups provided Egypt's millers with real-time shipping data, predictive yield forecasts, and tailored logistics support, tools the U.S. had never offered. The impact was immediate. Grain shipments began flowing through the port of Halifax into the Mediterranean, bypassing bottlenecks that had plagued U.S. routes. Egyptian officials reported fewer delays, more consistent quality, and perhaps most importantly, lower risk. To lock in the relationship, Canada and Egypt established a bilateral wheat assurance framework, a formal guarantee that Canada would maintain shipment minimums even during global disruptions. In the fragile world of food security, that guarantee is gold. For the U.S., the loss of Egypt's trust was more than just a hit to exports. It was a symbolic break in a decades-old trade bond. In the language of diplomacy, when a nation reassigns its food lifeline, it's not simply shopping for lower prices. It's making a statement about who it believes will stand by them in a crisis. And in 2025, Egypt's answer was Canada. But if Egypt's pivot was a matter of survival, the next country's shift was a matter of frustration, the kind that builds over years until, one day, your closest neighbor turns around and takes their business elsewhere. For decades, the trade relationship between the United States and Mexico was as close as it gets. Avocados, strawberries, tomatoes, tequila, millions of pounds of fresh produce and spirits crossed the border every day, feeding restaurants, grocery chains, and households on both sides. It was a rhythm so ingrained that neither side questioned it, until politics got in the way. In 2025, renewed trade tensions between Washington and Mexico City led to politically motivated inspections at the U.S. border. On paper, these were just heightened security checks. In reality, they turned a seamless flow of goods into a clogged artery. The delays were brutal. Refrigerated trucks loaded with ripe avocados from Michoacan sat in the sun for hours, sometimes days. By the time they cleared, entire loads had spoiled. Exporters who had built their businesses on razor-thin freshness margins were suddenly losing tens of thousands of dollars per shipment. And it wasn't just produce. Mexico's world-famous tequila and mezcal producers were hit with new U.S. labeling restrictions, forcing them to redo packaging, print new compliance materials, and, in some cases, delay shipments for months. That was the breaking point. Canadian grocers saw an opening and moved with precision. Loblaw and Metro offered Mexican exporters what they desperately needed: refrigerated rail routes directly into Canadian distribution centers and advance payment contracts that locked in both price and delivery schedules. The offer wasn't just competitive, it was a lifeline. Within just 6 months, Canada's imports of Mexican fruit surged over 30%. Liquor boards in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario launched South of the North campaigns, promoting Mexican spirits as premium staples for Canadian consumers. Tortilla and salsa producers that once sent containers through Los Angeles rerouted them to Montreal, where inspections were faster and shelf rotation times shorter. Even Mexico's logistics companies adjusted their maps. Some now send goods north through the port of Manzanillo, then by ship to Canada's Pacific gateways, bypassing the United States entirely. The two governments went further, announcing a NAFTA Plus produce agreement that guarantees tariff-free food exchange between Mexico and Canada, even as U.S. negotiations remain frozen. For the United States, the shift is a warning shot. When your own next-door neighbor, a country whose trade has been intertwined with yours for generations, decides to hedge its bets and diversify away from you, it's not just a loss of goods, it's a loss of confidence. And in trade, confidence is everything. If Mexico's pivot was born of frustration, the next one is driven by ambition. Because India, the world's spice capital and a global agricultural giant, isn't just moving some of its exports to Canada, it's building an entire supply chain presence there, brick by brick. If Chile's shift was about fruit and Mexico's was about fresh produce, India's pivot strikes at something far more enduring: the building blocks of flavor itself. For decades, the United States was one of India's most reliable buyers of spices, rice, lentils, and tea. Containers of turmeric, cumin, basmati rice, and masoor dal would flow steadily into American ports, feeding not only South Asian communities but millions of households that had embraced these staples. But in 2024, that reliability began to crumble. A combination of new U.S. food safety reviews and tightened import quotas created massive backlogs at ports like Newark, Los Angeles, and Long Beach. Containers sat waiting in holding areas as compliance checks dragged on, sometimes until contracts expired. In an industry where seasonal demand and festival deadlines matter, those delays were devastating. India, the world's largest producer of lentils and basmati rice, didn't wait for the situation to fix itself. It looked for a partner who could move goods faster, more predictably, and with less political noise. That partner was Canada. Within months, Ontario trade officials launched expedited clearance lanes for Indian agricultural products. For major exporters in Mumbai and Chennai, the difference was night and day. Goods that once faced 2-week delays in the US could clear Canadian customs in 48 hours or less. Canadian retailers moved fast. Chains like Sobeys and Longo's signed multi-year exclusivity deals with Indian spice conglomerates, guaranteeing premium shelf space and steady restocking. It wasn't just the big names either. Smaller regional exporters found Canada more accessible than they had ever found the US. The numbers told the story. By the first quarter of 2025, Indian spice imports into Canada had surged 20%, while US imports dropped 12% in the same period. And India wasn't just shipping more product, it was planting roots. Conglomerates like Tata Consumer Products and Adani Agri-Logistics built warehouse hubs in Brampton, Ontario and Surrey, British Columbia. These weren't temporary storage spaces. They were integrated into Canada's retail grid, allowing for rapid distribution nationwide. The product range expanded beyond dry goods. Frozen parathas, pickled vegetables, Ayurvedic health products, all once destined for New York or Houston, began appearing in Ottawa and Calgary. In some Canadian cities, Indian lentils and spices are now so plentiful that prices have dropped slightly, even as they rise in the US. For India, the calculation was simple. Canada offered predictability, growing consumer demand, and a large South Asian diaspora eager for authentic products. For the US, the loss was harder to quantify, but clear in the long term. When one of the world's agricultural superpowers starts giving you less priority, it's not just a supply chain issue, it's a sign your market influence is slipping. And while India's pivot speaks to trade ambition, the next country's move hits on something more symbolic. Because the United Kingdom, a nation bound to the US by history, language, and culture, has decided that when it comes to groceries, Canada is the safer bet. The United Kingdom and the United States have long prided themselves on having a special relationship. That phrase gets tossed around in politics, but it also plays out quietly in everyday trade, right down to what's stocked in your local grocery store. For decades, British goods had a clear, almost automatic path into American kitchens. Digestive biscuits, Yorkshire tea, clotted cream, marmalade, staples of British heritage that made their way across the Atlantic without much fuss. If you were an expat in the US, you could count on finding your favorites somewhere, even if it meant paying a little extra. But in 2024, the special relationship hit a snag, not in Parliament or the White House, but at the loading docks. Post-Brexit trade complexity had already made exporting more cumbersome for UK businesses. Then the US layered on new food labeling requirements, rules about nutritional panels, allergen disclosures, and packaging design that forced British exporters to overhaul entire production runs just for the American market. For small and mid-sized producers, that was a deal-breaker. Compliance costs spiked, shipping schedules became unpredictable, and risk piled up. Canada, however, offered a way out. Provincial import agencies began waiving secondary packaging requirements for certain UK goods, streamlining customs processing without lowering quality standards. Canadian grocery chains responded quickly. Farm Boy and Save On Foods launched British heritage sections, stocked with imports from Cornwall, Yorkshire, and Kent. Products that once trickled into niche specialty shops now had pride of place in mainstream aisles. The shift didn't go unnoticed in shipping circles. The Port of Liverpool quietly restructured one of its major North American routes, diverting containers from New Jersey to Halifax. Within 10 months, British food exports to Canada had risen 21%. This wasn't just about expat-heavy cities like Toronto or Victoria anymore. Rural Canadian towns, places with no historical connection to the UK, began stocking British biscuits and teas simply because supply was steady, margins were solid, and customers liked having them. Then came the statement that really made waves. In early 2025, the UK Department for Business and Trade officially ranked Canada as the most stable North American food trade partner. A decade ago, such a ranking would have been unthinkable. Today, it's simply pragmatic. For the United States, losing ground to Canada in British imports may seem small compared to, say, wheat or beef. But symbolically, it's a fracture in a cultural bridge that once felt indestructible. And fractures have a way of spreading. Because if even your oldest allies are rethinking the basics, biscuits, tea, jam, then the door is wide open for others to follow. And that's exactly what happened next. In fact, the most shocking pivot on this entire list didn't come from a neighbor or a casual trading partner. It came from Japan, a country whose loyalty to the US food market had, until now, been nothing short of unshakable. For decades, Japan's approach to food exports into North America followed one unbreakable rule: the United States comes first. Whether it was delicate matcha powder, artisan miso, premium soy sauce, or sushi-grade fish, Japanese producers saw America as their anchor market, the first port of call, the top priority, the unquestioned destination. That loyalty wasn't just about economics. It was rooted in cultural diplomacy. Japanese food is more than a commodity. It's a projection of identity, craftsmanship, and pride, which is why what happened in 2025 hit Washington like a silent earthquake. It started, as these things often do, with bureaucracy. The U.S. introduced a sweeping customs overhaul targeting East Asian food imports. On paper, it was about strengthening compliance. In practice, it meant longer inspections, unpredictable clearance times, and, according to exporters, a level of scrutiny that bordered on disrespect. Containers that once cleared within 48 hours were now being held for weeks. Fresh seafood shipments intended for high-end restaurants in Los Angeles and New York were arriving late, their quality compromised. Tokyo had seen it coming. Japanese trade executives had been warning Washington since 2023 that such changes would drive exporters elsewhere. The warnings went unheeded. Canada, however, was listening. In early 2025, Ottawa quietly expanded its pre-clearance food agreements with Japan, guaranteeing faster port procedures and, perhaps most importantly, a tone of respect in trade relations. For Japanese exporters, that mattered just as much as logistics. The pivot was immediate and massive. In just the first 6 months of 2025, over $3.2 billion in Japanese grocery exports were rerouted to Canada, a 34% year-over-year increase. Entire supply chains were redrawn. Sushi-grade tuna that once entered through Los Angeles now landed in Vancouver. Bottles of tamari and ponzu sauce hit Calgary shelves before they ever saw New York. Japanese green tea producers inked exclusive shelf deals with Canadian chains like T&T and Loblaw. Even cultural delicacies, mochi, daifuku, pickled plums, that used to be reserved for niche Asian supermarkets in the US began appearing in mainstream Canadian grocery aisles. Then came the moment that made it official. In an internal policy update circulated among Japanese trade delegations, Canada, not the United States, was listed as Japan's primary North American food trade partner. That wasn't a typo. That was a deliberate rewriting of the map of trust. Because for Japan, grocery exports aren't just business. They are a carefully curated form of soft power, a way to strengthen relationships, shape perceptions, and export culture. And when that trust was strained, it was Canada, not the US, that offered open ports, predictable policies, and a handshake that meant something. Trade wars don't always explode with headlines. Sometimes they erode, quietly, container by container, until one day the balance tips. And with Japan gone, the message to America is clear. No loyalty lasts forever, not even at the dinner table.